So just after daybreak, Jesus is standing on the beach. But the disciples didn't know that it was Jesus. See, they didn't recognize him. Now, this is actually the third time in John that Jesus had appeared since the crucifixion. And y'all know about the rule of threes, right? It usually means, wake up, pay attention. This is really important. You didn't catch it the first 2 times. This is the last time I'm going to say it. So Peter had wanted to go fishing the night before, and the disciples decided to come along. And they'd been fishing all night long in the dark with no luck. And that morning, Jesus calls out to them from the shore, "Children, have you any fish?" And they say no. Jesus then says, "Why don't you just cast that net to the right side of the boat?" And what I imagine is that they're fishing in a cove, right? Here's the cove. And they're fishing in the cove. And he says, "Why don't you fish into the ocean? Why don't you stop fishing at the familiar? Fishing at the 100 yards toward the beach. And maybe toss the net on the ocean side, on the seaside, out towards the unknown." And so they cast the net to the right side. And then, as it's written, they were barely able to haul the net because there were so many fish. They had to drag it all the way to shore. Now, no one had recognized who was giving them all this sage advice up until this point, when the disciple whom Jesus loved, it said. Now, obviously, Jesus loved all of his disciples. But I imagine that he really, really loved the disciple who could recognize his spirit alive in the world well beyond his death. That was the beloved disciple. May we all be so attuned and so beloved. And the disciple whom Jesus loved says to Peter, "It's the Lord." Now, Peter hadn't recognized Jesus. But you don't know Peter, right? Peter. Peter is a character. Peter is a character. So Peter is this fisherman chosen by Jesus who gets to walk on water. He witnesses the transfiguration. He can't stay awake. Well, he denies Jesus. He's restored by him. And then he gets to preach the day of Pentecost. Peter is so complicated, so human, so fallible. So Peter hears that it was Jesus telling him to fish on the other side of the boat. And so hurriedly, I can imagine, he puts on some clothes and he jumps into the sea. Now, he was fishing naked, right? Y'all caught that? But see, all of the disciples were likely fishing naked. See, there's some disputes about whether or not they had underclothes on or not. But back then, if you were a fisherman or a carpenter or you had any kind of job, if you were a working class folk, you likely only owned one good set of robes. So just imagine that I had, a Gucci suit for you with some nice Coach shoes, and you only have one pair of underwear. And I was going to send you out fishing all night long, getting sweaty, right? Chances are you're probably going to strip. But if you're going to be casting heavy nets all night long, not only do you not want to get your robes sweaty, robes are not the easiest thing to be casting big, heavy nets in, right? But Peter has always fascinated me. You see, Peter sees Jesus, puts on his robes, and dives headfirst, I imagine, into the water, while the other disciples are doing the hard work of dragging in that big net full of fish, right? He's just swimming to shore. Now, granted, there's lots of lessons in this scripture, but how about this one to start off with? If we're going to recognize Jesus, if we're going to recognize the spirit of love and truth and justice in the world, that spirit over which death has no dominion, then we might need to imitate the beloved disciple. And in fact, be vulnerable ourselves. We have to do the hard work naked. Now, not literally, of course, but vulnerable, right? And if we want to be abundantly successful, we are called to be vulnerable, and we are called to explore the unfamiliar territory on the other side of the cove, right? Let me explain. The disciple who recognizes Jesus was naked and stayed that way, did he cover himself in the presence of God? No. Does he weigh himself down with robes and garments? No. But Peter burdens himself with layers of clothes that get in the way and makes a 100-yard swim much more difficult. I don't know if you've ever swam 100 yards. I used to be a swimmer. Did you know that? I did. I was an individual medley swimmer and a butterfly stroker. Let me tell you, 100 yards the first time you learn how to swim is far. So he dives in, I imagine head first, struggling with every stroke with his clothes, wearing down his arms, right? And emerges, I imagine, before the feet of Jesus, exhausted and panting and his clothes all drenched and heavy. Why did he need to do that? Why does Peter put on his robes to go swim? To make a point. To remind us that we seem to think that we have to be something other than who we already are in order to be good enough to do God's work in this world. For some reason, we think that we have to cover ourselves. It happened in Genesis too, right? We think we have to cover ourselves. Don't you think he can see through all that? Not even any reason to do that. But for some reason, we have this delusion that if we cover ourselves with layer upon layer, that we won't be seen. And we may not be seen by people who love us. Peter reminds us in this story to pay attention to what might be getting in our way of reaching the way and the light and the truth. What might be keeping us from finding a way, seeing the light, or discovering the truth? What layers might we have put on that bog us down and may even make us feel like we're drowning? Now, I have a few suggestions. You knew I would. Maybe we're putting on layers of perfection. Our idea of what perfection is. Or pride. Maybe it's our fear. Can you imagine putting on a layer of fear? Maybe those layers are our clinging to expectations about outcomes or the need for certainty. But there is no reason to hide yourself before God. A God who knew you before you were knit in your mother's womb doesn't need you to dress up. So if what you're doing in this world is important and holy and on the path, then your vulnerability is required as well. It's almost laughable to assume that your whole self can't be seen hidden behind a robe or a fig leaf. So let's not buy into some mythology about vulnerability that the culture tries to teach us, that vulnerability is weak or gullible or frail. Because that mythology is the very thing that is keeping us from our greatest strength. That mythology gives us permission to not do the thing that might matter most. When we're fooled into believing that vulnerability is weak or gullible or frail. And the thing is, that mythology can also be gender related. When researching vulnerability in heterosexual relationships, Dr. Brené Brown, who's a social worker and a PhD, wrote, "If you show me a woman who can sit with a man in real vulnerability, in deep fear, and be with him in it, I will show you a woman who A, has done her own work, and B, does not derive her power from that man. And," she says, If you could show me a man who can sit with a woman in deep struggle and vulnerability and not try to fix it, boy, that resonated a bit. If you show me a man who can sit with a woman in a deep struggle and vulnerability and not try to fix it, but just hear her and be with her and hold space for it, I will show you a man who's done his work and a man who doesn't derive his power from controlling everything. I love this story about Peter in John 21 because not only are we reminded to be vulnerable, but the scripture also reminds us to take a look at where we're casting our net. See, we have to break past the status quo. These definitions of what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman are going to have to be broken down. We have to break through the status quo into the unknown. Because if we're only casting the net toward the shore, toward the familiar, we just might miss the abundance of the sea. Now, maybe 2,500-year-old stories about naked fishing don't stick with you. So let me offer you one from this generation. It's a true story. A little modern-day parable of sorts about a dear friend of mine who had a moment of vulnerability of her own that I have never forgotten, and now I'm going to guess that you probably won't either. She's a Texan, and at the time she was in her 20s, so likely she was feeling pretty invulnerable at the time, both because of her age and also because of the culture of her home state. Well. So one evening, she went fishing on the Brazos River near dusk with what she considered at the time to be only the essentials. She's grown up since then, just so you know, but only to be the essentials: beer, cigarettes, a lighter, and fishing tackle. So she goes down to the river. You know, you have to kind of climb down into the bank, right? So she's down in the river doing her fishing, and she gets a little peaceful and still, a little satiated, a little relaxed. And a few beers later, she begins to notice that it had become dark, quite dark, and it was getting cold. This point always reminds me of the other Peter story that I love so much, that stay awake story. You just stay right here, right? And stay awake. I'm going to go over here. Stay awake. Can't do it. Can't do it. Have to numb out. Have to fall asleep. I can't do it. Anyway, so looking up toward the direction from which she had come, my friend could no longer see where she'd made her way down from the road. And she realized that in order to get back to her car, she was going to have to scale up that steep and muddy bank and make her way back through the dense wooded area in complete darkness, with only a half a pack of cigarettes, a lighter, and now several empty beer cans. A state of panic came over her as she tried to feel her way along the muddy bank, her fingers slipping in between roots. Have y'all seen a Texas river? I mean, just look at an Oklahoma river, you get the idea, right? Or have you seen hillbilly hand fishing? Okay. So that might give you a sense of what I'm talking about here. There are some deep holes to step in, right? There are roots to trip over. There are water moccasin to fear. There are really big catfish with big teeth. This is real danger here, I'm trying to explain. So after a few stumbles, she pauses, completely and totally terrified to consider her options and to get a hold of herself. And then she realizes exactly what she has to do. She would have to burn an article of clothing to light the way. So starting with her sock, she finds a stick, she ties her sock around the stick, and she manages to get it caught on fire. Now it burned brightly and fast. But it was enough for her to manage to make it up the bank and about 15 feet into the woods. And then it went out. Well, she'd already done it once before, right? She's got 2 socks. So then came the other sock. And 20 more feet into the woods. She's in the middle of the woods as the second sock flame burns out and she can't see a thing. And so she set fire to her shirt. Now, even crazier than the fact that she just had set fire to her shirt is that my friend was not alone. So this was not just one person who thought this was a good idea. It was two. And then after her shirt was gone, my friend actually convinced someone else, right? So after her shirt grew dim, her friend then offered her shirt off of her own back. And they set that on fire. So they're another 25, 50 feet into the woods. Finally, certain that this was the only way they were going to get out of the woods, laughing and scared, but vibrantly alive. Every other piece of outer clothing charred and on the ground behind them. She set fire to her shorts. Now you can imagine they're both in boots. And their undergarments. So the two girls emerge onto the road where salvation finally awaits them in the form of her pickup truck, and they made the hour drive home in their undergarments, praying that no one would stop them before they got there. Now there's a parable. See, the lesson that she learned at the time was pretty literal. Clothes burn faster than you'd think that they might. And never, ever forget a flashlight when you go fishing, no matter what time of day. But the meaning over time has become much more about resourcefulness, about creativity, about vulnerability. If you're in danger, if you're wandering through the wilderness, it may be that the only way out, the most creative and resourceful way, is to get vulnerable. Now, Dr. Brené Brown, who I mentioned earlier, has written 3 books that are all interrelated. One is on perfectionism, one is on shame, and her newest is called Daring Greatly. It's about vulnerability. Now, I recommend all 3, but if you're going to only read one, start with the latest, Daring Greatly. Or if you don't want to read the book, go find the TED video. You can look up the TED Talk. Or she also has been on NPR recently on Being, so you can hear a whole hour-long interview with her about this book. But according to Dr. Brown's research, when she asked people to complete the sentence, vulnerability is, these were the responses that she received. Standing up for myself. Asking for help. Saying no. Starting my own business or changing jobs. Helping my 37-year-old wife with stage 4 breast cancer make decisions about her will. Hearing how much my son wants to make first chair in the orchestra and encouraging him while knowing that it's probably not going to happen. Ugh. Calling a friend whose child has just died. Initiating sex with someone I love no matter how long we've been together. Signing up my mother for hospice care. The first date after a divorce. Sharing a story that I wrote or a piece of art that I made. Waiting for a biopsy to come back. Coming out. Admitting I'm afraid. Standing up for myself and my friends when someone else is gossiping. Being held accountable. Asking for forgiveness. And this one I love. Having faith. Do these sound like weaknesses to you? Or frailties? Or people who are gullible? Think about the moments in your own life when you have felt brave. This is my favorite line, and if you take nothing else away, I want you to take this. You'll take that naked story because it's memorable, but take this too. Vulnerability, Dr. Brown says, sounds like truth, but feels like courage. Vulnerability sounds like truth and feels like courage. The irony irony, you see, is that courage is born out of vulnerability, and vulnerability actually makes us stronger. It is courage and therefore vulnerability that gets us out of the wilderness, that helps us see the path to God, that brings in the abundant catch. But we have been trained otherwise. We want strength without having to be vulnerable. But see, plowing ahead without the vulnerability just makes us tough, thick-skinned, calloused, and so likely incapable of feeling anything, joy or pain. Now, many people are confused about the difference between tough and strong, and it took me a while to learn the difference as well. But you see, courage, the word courage comes from the French word for heart, cœur. And it requires that we stay connected emotionally, that we open our hearts, that we bare our bellies a bit, that we be vulnerable in the face of difficulty. Because if we choose to run away, to be disconnected from ourselves, from our heart, or from another, and instead attempt to add yet another layer of protection, then it's not about cœur. It's about hardening our hearts. It's about a hard heart. And we can feel like we're drowning. We can get stuck in the darkness. When we choose to layer on the protection, we become tougher, not stronger. And instead of feeling courageous, it doesn't feel courageous when we're not vulnerable and we're trying to get tough. We feel shame. Now, in her research, when Dr. Brown asked about what vulnerability feels like, this is what she found. Taking off the mask and hoping the real me isn't too disappointing. Taking off a straitjacket. Taking the first step towards what you fear the most. Many people suggested that they know vulnerability is happening, they need to be vulnerable, when they feel the need to strike first before being struck. Now pay attention to this one. When you feel like you want to be aggressive and strike first, what the situation is really calling for is vulnerability. Wanting to strike first is a poker tell. It's a sign that we need to pay attention to. Wanting to strike first means that we are fearful and that the only solution is connection. And that connection comes from vulnerability. And whether or not we connect to or are vulnerable with the person that we're fearful of depends on whether or not it's a real threat, right? But regardless, it's getting vulnerable that's going to get us through, whether or not that's with a minister, a therapist, a trusted friend. Other responses from her research? Feeling vulnerable feels like the time between hearing the gunshot and waiting to see whether or not you've been hit. And the number one answer that Dr. Brown found in her research? Vulnerability feels like being naked when everyone else is clothed. Bearing ourselves for the world to see, being vulnerable, is about the willingness to show up and be seen in our lives. And in those moments when we do show up, those powerful moments, they become the most powerful, the most significant moments of our lives, even if they don't go well, because you brought your whole self to the table, right? I did a clearness committee recently with a group of other ministers, and one of the things that came out of that clearness committee was this phrase that I've been repeating to myself, and I think it's so helpful that I want to share it with you, and that is, I belong to no one but God. No one. And when you know that, when you hold that, and you're willing to look at honest feedback about yourself, and you're willing to take in what people are saying and still maintain your own integrity, it helps. So when we're willing to get clear about what's most important, about what we're willing to let go of, our deal breakers, we can hold on to what we must, our integrity, our compassion, our core values, and set fire to the rest. We can set fire to the rest to light our path ahead. And so let us begin first and foremost. With our socks. What have you been holding on to that you could share with someone close to you? A trusted friend or a therapist or a minister? See, the cost of not being vulnerable, the cost of disconnection, of thicker and thicker and thicker skin is high. Because eventually it's going to catch up with you. So when we don't show up, when we're not vulnerable, that very lack of vulnerability results in feeling as though our lives have no meaning or no purpose or no joy or little happiness. It can be frightening. A life devoid of meaning unless we are in fact vulnerable. But see, having faith means standing naked before God. Because once you've stood naked before God, you know you're never alone. And so when you're called to go fish naked, God's going to be there pointing out the abundance for you. When you're out in the wilderness, God might be asking you, calling you to fish naked, to find your way out. But see, here's the good news. Our expressions of courage have a multiplier effect. So to others, what feels like vulnerability to us, to them looks like courage. So we spread courage around and encourage others just by showing up and being real and being vulnerable. By trying new things and taking more chances and setting new boundaries. At the end of this book, Dr. Brown wants to teach her children to do the same. So she writes a manifesto for her home. And as a parent, she says, I want our home to be a place where we can be our bravest selves and our most fearful selves. Where when we practice difficult conversations and share our shaming moments from life, and then when we fail, we'll fail together, daring greatly. Now, I want our church to be the same. Where we practice difficult conversations and share our shaming moments from life, and then when we fail together while daring greatly. A place where we can come and ask someone to walk with us. Are you ready to begin today? To set fire to your socks. I don't have a stick, but to set fire to your socks. To light the way. Maybe it's time for you to try fishing naked.